All right, colleagues. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to today's joint webinar between the Center for the Transformation of Schools in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA and the Association for California School Administrators, ACSA. Our conversation for today, working overtime, prioritizing staff health, well-being, and retention for school systems during the pandemic. Is where we're going to go in for the next hour and be together. And we want to thank you for, this topic is on the minds of everyone. If you're in education right now, we want to thank you for joining us during your lunch or between meetings on a really busy Thursday. My name is Joe Bishop. I direct the Center for the Transformation of Schools with Dr. and Professor Tyrone Howard, who you'll hear from shortly. And we're also joined by an esteemed group of guests, including Dr. Erin Simon. And Dr. Simon is the Assistant Superintendent of School Support Services at Long Beach Unified. She's also the President-elect of ACSA. Thank you for being here, Dr. Simon. And as you can see, just to give everybody a visual, and thank you to Geneva Sum, who's our communications director, who is organized today's session, but we want to give you kind of a visual of where everybody is in California. Joanne Faust is principal for Washington Elementary. Hi, Joanne. In El Centro elementary school district. And both are going to share their insights on what they're doing, both at the central office from Dr. Simon's perspective and at the school site from Principal Faust's perspective, to respond to the needs of their team during the pandemic. Last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Wes Smith, and Dr. Smith is the Executive Director for ACSA, and he'll provide really a statewide perspective for us to think about what policies and strategies we need now to better support school leaders during the pandemic. And as we think about the structure for today, so we'll have about 35 minutes of presentations followed by 15 minutes of Q&A that Dr. Howard and I will moderate and facilitate. And I'd like to encourage you, if you have a question, please put your question in the chat box for presenters in real time. We'll try to respond as quickly as we can, but also probably raise it up again during the Q&A session. And I know this is always the question everybody asks. We will share the PowerPoint, we promise, in a follow-up email over the next few days. But again, we're so honored to have you with us today. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Geneva. Okay, so it has been well documented that students have experienced tremendous disruptions in their learning over the last few years, last two school years, I should say. And in some instances, death related to the virus, job loss for families, social isolation during a critical time of development for young people, and fear, anxiety, and uncertainty, which unfortunately has become our new norm as a world, or as a society, I should say. Unlike students, educators have been asked to forge ahead despite the profound effect of the virus in their personal lives. And it's taken a toll. Next slide, please. According to a recent national survey from Education Week, a majority of teachers, 60% approximately, are feeling the impact of job-related stress. Many are feeling less effective in their roles. And many are feeling that their site administrators are not adequately supporting them. We also see here, based on the survey, that 1 in 4 teachers are thinking of leaving the profession due to job-related stress. So as we think about the 1 in 4 number, we know this is a major red flag for our community, considering that most districts are experiencing subject area teacher shortages and staffing shortages broadly. So let's get a little bit deeper and unpack these numbers, what they mean for school sites, and more importantly, what are the solutions moving forward? Next question, please. Or sorry, slide, I should say. So the guiding questions for today for us to all think about. So, and you're going to hear this, our presenters are going to answer these questions in different ways, but what are the underlying factors of job-related stress, as we just saw on that slide, for the education profession broadly that have been accelerated during the pandemic? What systems, what comprehensive systems of support are needed from school site and school system leaders, for educators and staff? And last but not least, how do we maintain the focus on meaningful and equitable learning conditions for young people, especially those impacted most because of the pandemic, which has been mostly students of color, Black and brown students in California. So Let's dive in. Let's explore these questions together. And again, work towards solutions, starting with Dr. Tyrone Howard, Professor of Education at UCLA and Faculty Director for CTS.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bishop. It is an honor and a privilege to be here today. And we want to thank AXA for their partnership on this important topic, because there have been so much that we have seen, witnessed, experienced over the past 18 months, as Dr. Bishop mentioned. And we feel like these kinds of forums are important to help bring us together, to think, to problem solve, to collaborate, and try to figure out how we can bring research, theory, practice, and policy together in a way that helps to lift up our children, who are our number one priority. It goes without saying that leaders are in really, really, important positions as we think about how schools continue to try to move beyond COVID. We recognize that we're not completely out of the woods yet. And I think it's important to create platforms such as this one to hear what's working, where we're having success, or where interventions are making a big impact. One of the things I want to do to lift up and start the conversation, if we can go to the next slide, please, Geneva, is there was I think a really interesting article that was written by Dan Sinker in The Atlantic, titled "Parents Are Not Okay." And while so much of attention has been placed on our students, obviously, part of what we have to remember and recognize is that our students are part of ecosystems. And one of the major parts of their ecosystem are their parents and caregivers. And over the past 18 months, what we must recognize is that parents have been full of anxiety, anger, fear, impatience, uncertainty, misinformation, schools closing, schools opening, vaccinations, no vaccinations, masks, social distance, and the list goes on and on and on. And so part of what we continue to hear and see is that many parents and caregivers are showing up at school angry, upset, lashing out at leaders. And part of what we have to recognize in this current moment is that we can't take such approaches and behaviors personally, because what it really I think reflects is deeper seated suffering, deeper seated trauma, deeper seated angst, all the things we talk about that young people have suffered from over the past 18 months: depression, anxiety, fear. Parents and caregivers are also experiencing that as well. And so in this moment, we've got to have leaders to remember and to understand, as much as you can impress upon your staff, that the parents are not okay. For any of us who have young people who we send to school every day, it has been unprecedented what we've encountered. We also have parents and caregivers who have lost jobs. We have parents and caregivers who have been misplaced. We have parents and caregivers who have lost loved ones. So it's the culmination of all these factors that are going to show up at our schools oftentimes. So part of what we need to show and make sure we make a part of our just day-to-day exchanges with parents is greater degrees of understanding, greater degrees of empathy, greater degrees of patience and grace and flexibility to recognize that this moment has been hard on everybody. And part of what we have to recognize is that though we have data and from different counties of Department of Children and Family Services across the state that shows that child abuse and neglect reports have gone down, there are many child well experts who believe that in all actuality, over the past 18 months, the cases of abuse and neglect has actually increased significantly. Why has the number gone down? Because by and large, teachers, educators, principals have not been in close proximity to students as they have. But we know when parents and caregivers are frustrated, or when they're angry, oftentimes children are the ones who bear the brunt of some of that misguided anger and frustration. So we need to be mindful in this moment that parents are not okay, but we can be integral in helping to support parents and caregivers in this work. Next slide, please. While we know parents are not okay, well, we also need to recognize that teachers are parents and teachers are also teachers. So the teachers are not always okay. And this is why the job of leaders is so pivotal in this moment, because what we're asking leaders to be mindful of is the fact that you are having to tend to students on the one hand, parents and caregivers on the second hand, and then teachers on the third hand. So I refer to it as a triple quandary. And this is what leaders are having to contend to in a real meaningful way. So what can we do to support teachers in this moment? One of the most essential things we can do is ask teachers on a regular basis, how are they doing? That can be small one-off conversations, but it can also be school-wide or district-wide surveys, just to hear from teachers firsthand, to see what they need, to hear what they want. Part of what we have to be mindful of is that as many of our teachers are stressed from just the work in and of itself, the students that they're contending with, and their own children, that in many instances, they may lash out at students in ways that are not necessarily personal. They may oftentimes not be as engaged as we want them to be. The data that Dr. Bishop showed a moment ago shows that almost close to half of teachers feel like they're not as effective doing their jobs because of all the stresses that they've been contending with. So we need to ask what they're doing, and ask how they're doing. And then we also need to ask what they need. And we're hearing that from some teachers we're talking to at UCLA Center X. Teachers are saying that, my principal doesn't ask what I need. I just sometimes need to vent for 5 or 6 minutes. I need more time and less meetings is what I need on occasions. I need someone to handle this parent because this parent is just relentless in terms of what his, her, or their needs are. So asking our staffs what they need and being very clear about not over-promising and under-delivering. If you can do certain things, be clear about what you can do, but don't promise things that we know we can't do. And then we also have to recognize vicarious trauma. Secondary traumatic stress is real. The data on this has been really, really disturbing, because what we see is that for teachers who are in high trauma situations, they start taking on the trauma of their students, oftentimes without even recognizing it. So what you have are situations where, as the more intense needs begin to become more complexified in the lives of our students bring those traumas to the classroom, and then teachers directly and indirectly oftentimes take on some of those same traumas that we see playing out in our classroom. So leaders, you have to play the role of really armchair psychologists. You're also armchair social worker. Your jobs, your roles, as if they weren't already full as they are expanding exponentially because of the social emotional needs of adults in this moment. And then we want to focus on retention, because what we have to be mindful of is that if we don't put those supports in place to help support our teachers, we will see an increasing exodus of teachers out of the field. That's what we can't have. And we know when that happens, those hard to staff schools, the hard to staff areas are typically the areas that are hit hardest. And so we need to hold on to teachers as much as we can, because what we don't want to find ourselves in a situation is long-term sub after long-term sub. That's not what our students need in this moment. We need to find ways to support, and keep our teachers in place, which goes to our final point of how we think about systems and structures of support. How do we make sure that we're not just having one-offs, but we're thinking about how do we sort of lessen the load? I think we have to have a very different conversation about teacher self-care. There's been a lot of talk about teacher self-care, teacher self-care, teacher self-care. But what I've been saying is that why do we ask teachers to engage in self-care when we don't change the systems and structures around them that require them to have so much self-care in the first place? So what are the systems? What are the structures? How do we lighten the load? How do we rethink accountability structures? How do we think about the ways in which we sort of lighten some of the responsibilities, the duties that teachers have on a day in, day out basis, so that they can maintain a level of health, so that they can maintain a level of wellness? I see more schools now who are bringing in mental health therapists, not just for the young people, but for the adults as well. There's more mindfulness activities happening, not just for the young people, but for the adults as well. I say all this to say, as I prepare to close, is that what we need to be prepared for in this moment is making sure that the adults are supported just as much as the young people. And I don't know in the time that we've been doing this work, we've ever had to say that, but if there's ever a time that it meant more, and it really is something we have to take into consideration, it is this moment. If our adults are not well, needless to say, our young people will not be well. So we'll stop right there and pass off to Dr. Simon, I believe. Is that right, Joe?
Yes, Dr. Howard. Dr. Simon, welcome.
Thank you. And it's so great to be with each of you today. I mean, Dr. Howard just, laid out the foundation, just unpacked a lot of information that we know, right, is needed, and that's happening within our sites. And if we go to the next slide, he really touched upon, something that we as school leaders are seeing, right? Even that we're speaking to our teachers and our staff members about. And what we know right now is that staff is not okay. Teachers are not okay. And why is that important to really highlight, to consider, to talk about, to dialogue about? Because a teacher is the number one factor influencing student achievement. So if that teacher is not well, if they're pouring from that empty cup, right, then how are our students going to get served or responded to as they're going through their own vicarious trauma, as Dr. Howard mentioned? And then secondly, our principals, they are the number two factor influencing student achievement. And we know right now, Our students are, our principals are being stretched so thinly. Many of them are involved with health surveillance screenings, contact tracing, serving as subs, working on the weekends. They are burnt out and stressed as well. So we have to do more, especially amid this very dark time, to really support, right, the staff members that are so important to the academic and personal growth of our students. Next slide, please. So moving more into what we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has taken a significant toll on the well-being of teachers, principals, and other key staff members. I can speak to you about counselors and psychologists and nurses. That'll take another 30 minutes, but just know that there's so many people, instructional aides, rec aides, who are impacted at this time just based on the needs of COVID. And this is evident by the way of staff shortages due to resignations and retirements districts have seen in the past year and a half, even from superintendents, from assistant superintendents, from directors. The list goes on and on. People are at their breaking point. So moving into the next slide, please. Just some key things that Long Beach is doing to support staff during this very difficult time. We have wellness initiatives such as mindfulness kind of workshops and techniques we're using with our staff members. Even before every hard meeting, every discussion, there's 5 to 10 minutes, if not more, carved out just to discuss mindfulness, just for people to close their eyes, just to recenter themselves. There's social emotional learning trainings that are taking place within this district that are really focusing right now on the culture and climate. How are we tilling the soil in order to prepare more for the instructional aspects of that work? But now there's really a shift to a more comprehensive, coordinated approach to employee wellness. So not these one-offs, but something that we can build, that as a system we are utilizing, as Dr. Howard mentioned, to really tap into the needs that our educational leaders, staff members, teachers are asking for. It is an essential need. If we don't pivot further, we know there are going to be continued staff shortages, and then staff burnout is going to continue to be imminent. And moving forward, how are we prioritizing health? Pulse surveys. We utilize Panorama, Hanover, and many others to frequently have these surveys with our staff members so we know how they are. It also helps inform and educate us in regards to how do we provide services and needs and resources for our staff members that are very timely. Mindfulness and wellness, creating these groups for school sites and district staff. We have groups, circles of support on campus for school staff. We have our self-care module, so our teachers, our staff members can pick from when they are in need of some type of support. We are paying staff to attend wellness trainings. We are piloting some things before we are providing this to our entire district staff. So we're actually paying folks to listen, provide critique and feedback to help us. Conducting restorative circles at principals meetings to where principals can express what they're feeling right now, the stress, how they're not able to connect with their teachers just based on the demands. Even as they're corresponding with parents, and parents are upset about their child being quarantined or catching COVID. I mean, so on and so forth. There are so many things that are happening, even from a principal perspective, that we're trying to provide them with more supports as leaders of their school. And then we're also hiring and contracting staff and agencies. We've hired culture and climate coaches and social workers at all levels within our school sites. And then we also have a mental health concierge that we work with, just so that when our students and staff are in need and our parents are in need, they can contact these services and also be provided with a therapist pretty immediately. And then other agencies who support the well-being of our staff. And why? Because we know that we need to prioritize that if our staff members are going to be in front of our students on a daily basis to help them move forward and to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. All right, we're going to go a few more presentations here. And I think we just had a question that maybe Principal Fauci, you could talk about specific mental health strategies at the school site level, which Dr. Simon got into a little bit more, but welcome, Principal Faust. Great to hear from you.
Thank you. And that was great to hear everything that's going on over there in Long Beach. Thanks for sharing, Dr. Simon. On the next slide, you can see some things that we do all the time, but we might have some reminders. I know that if you're here, it's because you're either implementing practices to consider for your staff or you're looking for some ideas. So hopefully these are some reminders or some ideas that are useful. A lot of times we ask, when will it be enough? A lot of our staff are asking the same thing. But the question isn't really when will it be enough? The question is, how will I be more? And it's always that we can be more. One way that they particularly need right now is for us to always be present. We do this before, but right now it's even more important that we notice the demeanor of a staff member when they're not their usual happy self or they're more quiet. There may be something more going on that is not spoken about, or their stress level is higher. When we say good morning or we talk to other staff members, that we're present. And especially when we're in the middle of completing reports or talking to parents and we finish that meeting and someone comes to speak with us, that we're present in the moment and that we're really listening to what is being said, reading between the lines and using our emotional intelligence. Another thing that we do many times is we try to be vulnerable. When we're vulnerable, it may involve surveys, as was mentioned before. We might ask questions about what could we be doing to help you? The questions could be more particular too. So for instance, the question could be specific. What could I do differently with you? What do you wish I would ask about? And so that way we have very honest answers from our staff members. We can also ask our secretaries. Our secretaries many times may hear things that are said and there may be a common thread. And so we can ask our secretaries, hey, what is something common that you're hearing that our staff would like? Or what is a common statement? And so that way we can be very aware of the present and be vulnerable in that way that we accept those things that we may need to be looking into. When we're vulnerable and we have these surveys, we can model. We can model using those SEL strategies, the social emotional learning. When we have the parent, when we have a difficult situation, when we feel the stress level, that we're aware and that we model using those strategies that we're asking for all of our staff members to integrate and then to teach to our students. So that way it trickles down. And also when we are giving feedback, finally to staff members, that we are responding quickly. They might ask a question about what is going on with independent studies, or they may tell us something that happened with a parent concern, that we respond quickly and we let them know that we received that email, that we will follow up with them. Sometimes we might move forward and already start our process, but making sure that we let them know that we're hearing them. So those are some things that we always do, but right now it's particularly more important that we're mindful of those things. On the next slide, you can see that this is a main item that we tackle as site administrators. We are the liaison, we are the filter for state initiatives that are trickling to the district, and the district is mentioning what we need to do as a site. And when we bring those items to our staff, it makes a difference the way that it's presented, the way that we filter it. One way that could help alleviate some of the stress is to merge initiatives. For instance, there was a site and we were working on AVID, and the following year, especially present, we're focusing on social emotional learning, on culture, on relationships. Well, in the AVID book about rigor, the first 40 pages are about culture and relationships. So they're able to see how it integrates together. So that is helpful if you're finding ways to merge initiatives so that it doesn't seem like an additional thing. Another thing we can do that is very useful that was mentioned was acknowledging the situation, acknowledging that it is difficult, knowing that it is difficult to be breathing in carbon dioxide at times during the day, knowing that we have more expectations, acknowledging that it is a difficult time. And for instance, making changes because of that acknowledgement. For instance, if we're sending an email, we might wait to send the email, after back to school night. So that way teachers and staff members can focus on what needs to be done that day before we present the follow-up for the following week. And we are continuously doing forms of praise, letting them know that we recognize the hard work. And this is consistent. It's not on a weekly basis. It is consistent that we are praising and acknowledging and recognizing the hard work. It could be from a simple text message to a few staff members, an email. It could be a note on their car so that when they go for the weekend, they see a note on their car that lets them know that they are noticed and that they're acknowledged. Also, another thing that could be done at a school site, since that was mentioned, was creating an adult safe space. There might be a room that is used for storage or is an office that is not very much used. That space could become an adult safe space where they can go to calm down, where they can practice those breathing methods that they learn. So that is a really nice way for staff members to know that we definitely acknowledge the need for it. We're even creating a space for that. So that is something that could be done at school sites. And finally, another recommendation would be to simplify. Simplify things that are coming down that we need to make sure that we complete. So when it comes to any initiative, making sure that it is explained in a simplified manner. And in essence, using Universal Design for Learning, UDL, using that in our explanation for staff and modeling what it might look like so that they can understand that it's not so complex. And so that helps a lot as well for staff members. So hopefully these are some strategies, some ideas that you find useful.
So we started with the triple quandary presented by Dr. Howard, impacting school leaders, went to Dr. Simon, where Dr. Simon shared along with each other, integrating and focus on mindfulness and everything that you do really every day in all practices across the district. And Ms. Faust just shared some amazing examples for us to think about in terms of self-awareness and great intentionality. And what really strikes me is the small things really matter. And that framework you presented is really powerful. So I hope everybody can take it back. So as we go from all these levels, let's take us back to the state, Dr. Smith, ED of AXA. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, by the way. To Dr. Howard, thank you for setting the stage. You always do that so passionately. I get fired up whenever I listen to you speak, and today is yet another example of that. Dr. Simon and Principal Faust for sharing that really important district perspective and site perspective. So, when we look at the state level, we know that folks are traumatized all over the state. We know that our students, parents, and caregivers, as was pointed out, leaders at the site, district, county level, but our employees, our classified certificated employees and subs are especially traumatized, stressed out right now. When I go around the state, I'll say, how you doing? And people tell me, it feels like it's March, right? Someone the other day said, it feels like it's February. And I said, wow, it's an easy year for you, right? You're on easy street. You're doing 1 month better than many of your colleagues out there. But it just exemplifies that folks are under a lot of pressure. And to that point, to all the practitioners on this broadcast today, can I just say thank you to you most of all? We're talking about the stress. We're talking about the trauma. You're living it, and you're living it to benefit student lives. We owe you so much gratitude. Let's talk a bit about the factors. There are many, but certainly concerns about health and wellness are adding to this trauma. Questions around individual liberty are in play right now and adding to the pressure. People are worried about our economy and how that's going to affect their families, their livelihoods. And then amidst all of this, we have, like I've never seen before, polarizing politics. And we can say it's at the state level, but the folks on this Zoom know it's at the local level more severely because people are showing up at board meetings, fighting about everything. And it's putting our teammates in harm's way. in Amador County, a teacher was punched by a parent for upholding a state mandate. So it's getting physical, death threats around the state. These politics are harming people. And so what do we need at the state level? We need policy clarity and consistency. Far too often, we get policy that folks read and don't understand. You'll all remember when there was a mask mandate, but at the end of the policy, it said it was locally enforced. People were confused. What does that mean? Is it a state mandate, or at the local level, can I decide not to do it? So who did that put in harm's way? Well, it certainly put superintendents and boards who had to do that enforcement, site administrators who were on the front line, and the teachers who are having to say, hey, by the way, it's my job to enforce that. So now we're trying to educate folks and enforce unclear state policy. Then how many times have we moved the goalpost during the pandemic, right? It's one thing one day, 3 days later we changed it. And I get that things are evolving, our knowledge, our research, but we've got to have more consistency at the state level in our policy. That will help people. Some specifics as we're progressing today. I was on a call with 130 superintendents and the administration because the governor has been talking about new vaccine mandates for students, potentially for employees, and they've got to really think about these mandates. There are folks who will not be vaccinated or get tested, and there aren't substitutes to fill in for them. So what are we going to do when we make these mandates that can't be upheld at the local level because there aren't enough folks to do the work? For heaven's sakes, there aren't enough folks to do the work right now, right? So we've got to be really, really careful about how we address, and it's important, we get it. Vaccinations are really important, but how the state approaches that is really important. Talking about how busy we are, we've got to look at policies like AB 130 and make sure that when the politicians are well-intended, that they think about the scope that these variants can cause. Our independent study program was not ready for the scope we see at the local level. So we've got teachers stressed out right now, trying to do their job and also figure out independent study. We can't find people to help with that. Leadership would say in the building, well, just hire people to do the work. You can't find people to do the work. Well, we gave you money. Great, but you didn't give us bodies because you can't create those, right? And so we've got to be thinking about the scope of these things. I think Tanette Powell mentioned something about time. Right? There is no time, right? Because people are doing 3 jobs. So we've got to think about policies that reduce the time that our educators have. We got to do some ADA hold harmless. People are worried right now. We don't know where our students are. They're all over. They're displaced. They're moving. They're trying to find options. And people are worried about, will I get paid next year? That's a worry that the educators on this Zoom and all those in the state shouldn't have to worry about. We should have a hold harmless given the crisis we're in. There has to be flexibility around credentialing and substitute requirements. Let's not make it hard. Let's be safe. You want to hire some of my relatives to teach, but let's loosen those requirements so folks can be in the classroom and provide that support. And then finally, I would say we have to do more investments in really important services and ongoing investments in community schools. And I applaud the administration for what they've done in this budget, but when that money runs out, those community schools go away. We need a long-term commitment. Wellness centers are being used all over the state to benefit students and adult wellness centers where teachers can check in, support staff can check in. That should be funded ongoing. And then we've got to support those support providers with ongoing funding, the counselors, the nurses, et cetera, et cetera. So these are just a few of the things that can be done if the state wants to prioritize the wellness of the adults and the students in public education in California. And again, Joe, thanks for bringing us together.
Thank you, Axa and Dr. Smith. Based on the comments, clearly we're touching on some topics that everybody is dealing with in a big way, in different ways in their community. So it's great to hear that you feel like you're being heard right now. And that's exactly why we wanted to have this conversation. So Dr. Howard and I are we're gonna open up the microphone, which is a weird feeling on Zoom, I know, but we're gonna try our best. So if folks have questions for specific panelists, we're going to try to distribute the questions, but please don't be shy. We know you're probably multitasking right now, especially if you're at a school site, but do your best to type in a question. And I think, Dr. Howard, do you want to take the first question?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Principal Fowles, Dr. Simon, Dr. Smith. This is really powerful, and just based on the reactions that we're getting in the chat and in the Q&A section, obviously this is something people want to talk about. People are looking for answers. They're looking for support. They're looking for solutions. So I'm looking at the questions here. I want to see if I can direct this first question towards Principal Fowles and Dr. Simon. You all did a good job of talking about what you all do at your respective buildings and in your particular districts. What do you do for your own individual self-care and support and wellness?
Go ahead, Principal Fowles.
Oh, thank you. Well, I believe that it does start with us first. And so first is being aware, being aware of when our stress level is higher, being aware of when we feel that anxiety. And that's the first thing, just being aware of it. And then finding healthy ways to handle that stress, whether it is, for instance, right now, I'm actually in that safe space that I talked about. So I'm in that safe space. I've used it before myself. And so if I'm asking staff to use it, I'm going to use it at some point. So that's one way of starting off with it when I do realize it. Breathing always helps, making sure we have our oxygen so that we can use the best part of our brain. And also giving myself grace, letting myself know that it is a difficult time and going one step at a time forward, being patient with myself, because then that'll help me be patient with others. That's
nice.
Ways.
Nice. Thank you, Principal Fowles. How about you, Dr. Simon? What do you do? What are your strategies?
And people know I'm just not good at that, and I'm getting better. I become more of the mama bear. So for me, it's always ensuring that my staff is well. And I've been learning to follow, right? Many of the things I've been telling my staff. So for me, the mindfulness is significant. I take 10 minutes, 5 o'clock in the morning. That's just my time with me, with my faith, just to kind of recenter just myself. When days are hard, I close my door 5 minutes. I have a basketball. People know I'm an avid basketball fan, played the game, love the game. I hold that ball. I just reflect, close my eyes for 5 minutes. And just take that time just for me and family. Family is a great way for me to recenter myself. My husband, my 2 kids, the weekends are their time, although some of these weekends have been more so for contact tracing and surveillance screening, but they know that's their time. And with that, I'm able to recenter and just be in a very happy place, just to come back to that hard work. So I use several methods, but mostly mindfulness, family, faith, friends, those things keep very grounded.
I like it. 3 F's. I don't want Dr. Smith to feel left out. Come on, talk to us, Wes. What do you do?
Well, this is something that as I've done my research on life-work balance, it's important. It's this concept of disconnect and engage.
Mm-hmm.
Turning off your phone, getting out of in front of this device. And I think we've gotten worse about it during the pandemic because we've connected through our devices, right? But pick a time where you put your phone down, you disconnect from the internet, you take off that digital tether, and you engage the people who love you and who you love, or engage yourself, your own personal time. And I think employers should do more of this as well. No emails, no texts after a certain hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely no emails or texts or calls on a weekend unless there's an emergency and those are clearly defined. We should prioritize and respect people's time. But as individuals too, let's quit looking at, TikTok. Let's quit looking at Facebook, because when we do that, we're going to get a text or an email from somebody that's going to stress us out. So disconnect, put down the phones, get away from the computer. Time to engage your loved ones and yourself.
Well said. Bars. So we won't see you putting any more videos on TikTok then, right, Dr. Smith?
I haven't been good at any of those. So I've avoided that one. My kids are afraid that I never post a video.
Go ahead, Joe.
This webinar will be converted to a TikTok video shortly after. So Wes will be leading that, Dr. Smith. So there's some interesting questions, some great questions about structured and unstructured time. And another person asked about, do we need to hire full-time district wellness managers? Some folks just need, to Dr. Smith's point, and Principal Fowles, even Dr. Simon says, like, people just sometimes need time to unwind and do their own thing away from school in order to be the most productive. So how do you think about structured and unstructured time in a school setting, also at the district level, at the system level? Who wants to take that?
I'll start off with the question. I think it's important to have both. There are some people who are going to want to be fully engaged in that process, and some folks who are going to want to do things, at certain periods of time. I think also to that question, I really implore folks to hire culture and climate coaches, district wellness staff, specifically to take care of this issue. If you want the issue to be taken seriously, if you want buy-in, you got to have people who understand and who are experts around this work. It's not just someone who you feel has some form of knowledge, who has read some articles around district wellness and SEL that you're putting out there in front of teachers and staff members. You need experts around this work to get that buy-in and for that work to be really penetrable.
Yes, and we talked about, you mentioned about personal time as well as within work, structured time and unstructured time. When it's at work, sometimes when we have the unstructured time where there's time for us to say hello to one another or share something that is more personal, what's helpful is to let some people that really care about structure understand why it's important to have the unstructured time so that they can see the value of it when we're doing it. And then afterwards discuss it so that there's even more value to having some of the unstructured time as well as in the classroom, because a lot of teachers are worried about all of the learning that needs to be done. And so when you have unstructured time or time to discuss more and have more SEL, it's interesting how SEL could be a stress time for some educators because they're worried about the learning. But when there is also learning from the educators to understand why that's so important and how that ends up helping the learning, then it can help alleviate some of that stress to have some of the structured and unstructured time.
So this is good, these conversations around time, because time is valuable and time is important and time matters. And we oftentimes feel as if we don't have enough of it. So I saw a question here from one of my favorite people who's out there, Dr. Tanette Powell. And I want to throw this question out to anyone who wants to tackle it, because I think in this moment, we have to be okay doing some outside of the box thinking. We can't do things as we always have done them. We can't do the typical things we've done because we're not in typical times. I think atypical time requires atypical approaches. So Dr. Powell asked a really, I think, interesting question. Can teacher in-service non-pupil days ultimately become days off for teachers? Is that something that we could explore? Is that something that's feasible? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Remember, this is being recorded.
Yeah. I'm not at the district or site level, so I'm at the state level. So there's no risk for me to weigh in on that one. I think to your point, anything can be considered. One of my concerns would be in traumatic experiences, capacity building is essential. So we need capacity building now more than ever about those things that cause fears or concerns for the people in the classroom, right? So sure, it could be considered. I would be worried if we're having meaningful capacity building that we're sacrificing that. Let's find some other time. I would say this too, because you're asking this question about time. Like with time, there's a zero-sum game, right? There's only a certain amount of minutes, hours in the day. But I think we can also free up time, if you will, focusing on the right things, right? So less of the accountability stuff at the state level. Well, wouldn't it have been so much better for the wellness of educators across the state if instead of learning loss mitigation or enhancing learning or all these things, our messaging was, let's create relationships with students and between adults. If that was our focus this year, Dr. Noguera talks about this all the time. We need to focus on relationships, right? That would have freed people up. They've got this program in a school district that I heard about the other day where students are filming appreciation videos for their teachers. They're surprising them with, Mrs. So-and-so, this is why I appreciate you. They're focusing on relationships. And if that was a focus, I think we'd feel like we had more time, as opposed to all these other things that are heaped on our folks. But that was just one way to look at it.
Joe, I don't think Principal Faust or Dr. Simon want to tackle that question about teacher days off, because that might cause some
I would,
angst
but I'll
in
stay
some
away
places.
from it today, Dr. Howard.
Yeah, I can read. I'm good on nonverbal cues. I can pick up on them quite well. Go ahead, Joe.
So our team at UCLA is part of the state pilot with Orange County and Butte County to scale up California MTSS. And really the focus has been on addressing historic patterns around discipline disparities for students of color. I'm curious, somebody alluded to this in the chat box. How do we think about the curriculum and content we're presenting and the age in which our students are currently living? Because most of the standards were developed, content developed pre-pandemic. There was even a question about assessments. What are the appropriate assessments for this moment? Could you speak to that? Like in real time, how are you supporting your school sites to make learning as relevant and timely as possible for young people? While prioritizing wellness, sorry, while doing everything else, sorry.
Well, I think that one of the things that is really great is to implement Universal Design for Learning, UDL, because when we're talking about that, we're talking about different forms of learning and different forms of presenting. So when we're talking about different ways of learning, you're bringing in different material. So you have let's say you have this curriculum, but then you have this media, and then you have this speaker. It provides an opportunity to know what you have within your control, which is what you have ready to present. But when you implement things like UDL, it gives an opportunity to open it up, where the students are able to learn in different ways, where they're able to present their learning in different ways, and you're able to bring in other resources, other kinds of media, other formats, other perspectives into the conversation. So it's because there's certain things within our control and other things that are not, and we have our sphere of influence, but within what's in our control, we can bring in those other resources to add to that, so that we are making sure that we integrate more. That's one way.
And I would just say for some of our teachers, I mean, some are doing that now. I mean, they're doing that as far as prioritizing mental health, Dr. Bishop, with just check-ins, standing out in front of their doors, asking students how their day is going, how their night was, how their weekend was. And then from that, even in the classroom, right, having this time for just reflection or just discussion about things that are happening right within their community. Some folks are doing that, and I think it's essential. When you talk about relationship building, students want to feel that you respect, that you honor them, and that they have some type of agency, right, within your classroom, within the school. That's culture and climate all day long, right? That's something easy that we can do. We can be outside and greet our students when they actually come to school. We can actually go out to the lunch tables and have conversations, just sit down or just listen. I mean, these are just simple things I think that we can do. I know our days are busy, but we talk about building relationships and connections and prioritizing SEL and mental health, just simple nuggets that we can incorporate in our day to help students and sometimes even ourselves.
Dr. Simon, you make such an important point here, and I want to see if we can build on that a little bit, because I'm always reminded of my good friend, Dr. Dina Simon, who talks about, social emotional supports and wellness, if not done appropriately, can cause harm. And she talks about the need to create and think about more culturally responsive SEL, more culturally responsive wellness, because you can't use a one size fits all. What works for you, Dr. Simon, may not work for Principal Faust, and what works for Dr. Smith may not work for Dr. Bishop. So I was curious as to if either of you could talk about what does culturally responsive SEL look like? What does culturally responsive wellness look like? Because culture matters and context matters. And I know when I was, growing up, for example, one of the things my mother always told us was you don't share our dirty laundry. What happens in his house stays in his house. So now we want to open up spaces where we ask kids, come talk about what you're going through. And a lot of kids might be conflicted, like, okay, I want to talk about what's going on, but mama told me I better not ever talk about things. And I think that's culture, right? So what are some ways in which we can think about culturally responsive approaches to SEL and wellness?
I'll just lead up first. I would just say, first of all, when it comes to mental health, we don't even use the word mental health, all right, within any of our conversations. So we try to use terminology like social emotional support, or let's just have discussions, right? Let's just check in, right? Which really fits, within that category as well. And the majority of the time, I can tell you, when I'm out in the community, when I'm out at school sites, it's more so, hey, how you doing? I haven't seen you in a long time. You want to talk? What's up? I mean, and excuse my language, but I'm speaking to students and trying to meet them where they are. What's up? Tell me, what do you want to talk about, today, especially if I'm serving in a mentor-mentee kind of role, and maybe not, so much pinpointing, how is your family? Because I know sometimes family dynamics are different. Some of our students are living in foster care, maybe homeless. Those are very touchy situations. Really leaving it open-ended for students to really talk to me about what's pressing, what's fun, what's engaging, just whatever's on their mind, I think, for me at that time.
To add to what Dr. Simon mentioned about how we speak to students, it really is from us and our learning. So if we're truly learning social emotional learning, and we're integrating trauma-informed practices and culturally responsive teaching, and we're learning about general education and inclusive environments with special education, and putting it where we can see it all intertwined, and we truly learn it and we embed it, it's when we're able to notice the differences, the responses in others. And so when we're having a discussion, for instance, we will mention things such as, if you'd like to share, or where we are understanding that we're not all going to react the same way. And because of that, it's even intertwined when we're reading social studies, or even a story about why is it that you feel that student, that character acted that way, or why in history do you think that's how it, what are they explaining here? What's your perspective? And it brings in the ability to have those challenging conversations, because you have the SEL incorporated in it, and the person who is facilitating the discussion has those skills themselves and understands them.
Hey, Dr. Howard, this isn't nearly as sophisticated as their answers, but I think one of the things that we could do more of is quit assuming we know what our students want and need, and ask them. Ask our students how they're doing. How can we support them? What do you need? What are you interested in? Letting them be a real part of the solution instead of doing it to them.
No, that's sophisticated, Dr. Smith. You're right. I think anchoring their voices, their wants, their needs. And I always say too, I oftentimes think back to my days of being a classroom teacher. There's sometimes we have to read nonverbals. There's sometimes I remember looking at my student and thought, today is just not the day for me to say something to that student, because she's giving me a look that says, I don't want to be bothered. And I respect that, right? I also say we need to focus on the content and not the delivery. Sometimes we're fixated on how students say certain things and not so much on what they're trying to tell us. So I think we have to have some cultural humility as we do this work, to recognize that it's not always about how we do things and how we want things said to us and how we cooperate and how we communicate, but we've got to have some cultural humility to recognize that there's a multitude of ways of how people communicate their needs. And not just for our students. I maintain leaders. You have to be, I mentioned earlier, armchair psychologists. You have to read your staff the minute they step on campus every single day. She's got a smile. He looks angry. They don't look like they want to be bothered. He hasn't had his coffee yet. She seems like she's kind of really, running late this morning. You have to assess all of that in the first couple of minutes before you decide how you're going to engage. And that's why I think leaders are so amazing in terms of your ability to have to make these split-second decisions on people, because that's what your job entails.
Sounds like emotionally intelligent leadership, Dr. Howard. Case in point, but with the cultural lens and knowing your community too in a respectful way. We've had a number of questions about, could you share surveys or suggestions for implementing some of these components that Dr. Simon, Principal Faust have talked about. So if both are up for, and Dr. Smith, if you're aware of other tools that our colleagues can use to support more wellness strategies, we will share that with you if that's okay, with our team. Okay, because I know folks are looking for tools to bring back, and we'll share those resources in a follow-up email along with the PowerPoint and slide deck. Thinking to close this out, and we'll have the final word from Dr. Howard. But what's, for all of us sitting here, what's the one thing you wish you would have been doing around health and well-being when the pandemic started, that now you're kind of focusing on more? Or even what's that one point of advice for somebody who has had a crazy day right now and they're trying to look at, like, what's the one thing I need to do? So if you want to pick one of those questions, we'll quickly go around and then close out.
I would say check-ins with all staff. I think we really pinpointed, I think, certain staff members based on job descriptions initially. But if I had a magic wand, if I could have a redo, it would be to check in with all staff.
I think that Dr. Simon is right, that it would involve increasing how much we are asking and checking on people and giving the opportunity to notice, whether it's just from a text message or stopping by when we are present together. It would have been better to increase it before and then later.
I would tell people more, give yourself grace. Remember, you're only human. The educators I know are perfectionists. They hold themselves to such high standards. And so some of this is self-inflicted. And so I would just say, give yourself grace. We're not going to be perfect. Don't let perfect get in the way of making a difference for students. So I would share that more.
Well, I want to close this out by first and foremost thanking Principal Faust and Dr. Simon and Dr. Smith, and thanking all of you for being here today. I want to piggyback on something Dr. Smith said earlier. I thank you all for doing what you do in these perilous times. Your leadership matters, and your commitment matters, and your sacrifice is important. If I had to respond to Dr. Bishop's question, I think I would say the same thing along the lines of what each of our guests have said, is that just to be regular check-in folks. I would also say too that we need to recognize that whether we understand this or not, we're all in a collective state of grief. And if you think about those stages of grief, it starts off with denial that we're really going through something. And that denial can ultimately turn into anger, where we're mad about the fact that we're having to deal with this thing called COVID and all the things associated with it. And that anger then can turn into depression. And there are lots of us and people that we interact with who are still in this state of depression. Then you begin to bargain and try to say, okay, well, this is our reality, and how do I sort of like some parts of it, deal with some parts, and not like other parts? And then that bargaining ultimately turns into acceptance. And so I ask us to think about in this moment, we're grieving to some degree, to various levels, and it's okay to grieve, and give people the space and the time and energy to grieve, and to recognize that grieving manifests itself in lots of ways. And I think about the things I learned with my third graders many, many years ago. You can't take certain kinds of words and language personal. You've got to have a short memory. What happens on Monday is forgotten on Tuesday. What's said on Tuesday is a distant memory on Wednesday. So in this moment, we can't take it personal. We've got to recognize that we're all grieving to some degree, but also believe that we'll get through this. And we'll get through this because we will lean on each other, and we will empathize with each other, and we will support each other. And we will put our young people first. And when we put them first, we tend to do better. So I just want to thank all of you all for being a part of this important work that we do. You make a difference. You matter. Let no one else say that you don't. And let's continue to lean on each other and lift each other up as we do what's in the best interest of us and our young people.
Thank you, everybody, for participating in today's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Howard, for those inspiring words. Have a great week, everybody. Thank you.